Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We are glad that you're back with us today as we continue with our panels for the conference, US-Africa Reengagement, a new foreign policy agenda. And so we just finished from the first panel, which considered the US-Africa partnership for a stable and secure Africa. And we are now starting off our second panel, which is on advancing substantive democratic governance in Africa. And so my name is Dr. Chiedo, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. We are all witnessing the seeming change in tenor and approach of the current US administration to foreign policy. If nothing else, the Biden-Harris administration seem interested, or rather poised, to reintroduce decency, right, into international relations, and also in Washington, which one would argue, perhaps, creates a platform for substantive conversations that hopefully do not elevate paternalistic approaches or predatory approaches to relationships, right, to partnerships, particularly where you have a hierarchy. There is understandable curiosity, therefore, as to what this re-engagement might look like. So to help us explore this topic today are three experts whose scholarship drive their engagement in the practice community of democracy and governance on the continent. So with us today is Jennifer Cook. Jennifer is director of the Institute for African Studies at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. The Institute serves as the university's hub for research, scholarly discussion, and debate on issues relevant to Africa, and provides a platform for robust and inclusive discussion on Africa and its place in the global affairs. Cook is a professor of practice in international affairs, teaching courses on US policy toward Africa and transnational security threats in Africa. Cook came to GW from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she was director for the Africa program from 2009 to 2018 and deputy director 2000 to 2008, leading research and analysis on political, economic, and security dynamics in Africa. Prior to CSIS, she worked at the National Academy for Sciences and on the House Subcommittee on Africa in the US Congress. We're delighted to have you with us, Jennifer. Also with us is Dr. Ken Osheng-Opalo. Ken is an assistant professor in the School of Foreign Service. His research interests include legislative politics, subnational administration and local government, electoral politics, and the political economy of development in Africa. His first book titled Legislative Development in Africa, Politics and Post-Colonial Legacies, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, explores how the adaptation of inherited colonial legislative institutional forms and practices continue to structure and influence contemporary politics and policy outcomes in Africa. His works have been published in the British Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Democracy, the Journal of Eastern African Studies and Governance. We're delighted to have you with us, Ken.
Thank you.
And also with us is Professor Nick Cheeseman. Nick is a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham and was formerly the director of the African Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He mainly works on democracy, elections, and development, and has published research on Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Professor Cheeseman is the author or editor of more than 10 books, including Democracy in Africa 2015, Institutions and Democracy in Africa 2017, How to Rig an Election 2018, Coalitional Presidentialism and Comparative Perspective, 2018, Authoritarian Africa 2020, and most recently, The Moral Economy of Elections in Africa, 2020. In recognition of his academic and public contribution, the Political Studies Association of the United Kingdom awarded him the John Lewandowski Prize for Outstanding Professional Achievement by a mid-career scholar in 2019. The same year, his efforts to promote better understanding of democracy and how it can be protected and strengthened around the world won the Celebrating Impact Prize of the Economic and Social Research Council for Outstanding International Impact. Nick, we're so glad to have you with us. And so, you know, perhaps to start us off, to whip this into your introductory remarks, let us, you know, just open with your thoughts on what Africa-US Partnership for Democracy and Development has been in previous decades, right, or in previous administrations. There is little doubt that the changing global political landscape demands a rethinking of this partnership. The question, however, is what should this new partnership look like, right? What might the key elements be, and how might we define the contours of the new relationship? Jennifer, maybe we'll start with you. You are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, look, looking back on US policy and democracy promotion in Africa, there's always been a push and pull, or let's say a tug of war within US policy towards Africa. As competing interests, interests perceived as strategic or security related, are pitted against kind of the values agenda of human rights, democracy promotion, and humanitarian engagement. Obviously, this was most pronounced in the Cold War when the US selected its partners really based on their anti-communist credentials rather than their domestic human rights or democracy agenda. Although it couched its engagement in the language of democracy promotion and values. So, you know, the damage done from those partnerships, I think we still live with to a certain extent today. So it was most pronounced, perhaps, this competition among US interests in the Cold War, but that has persisted to some extent post-Cold War. The aperture on Africa and the understanding of US interests has expanded since the Cold War, and democracy certainly had a bigger role to play, but there are still plenty of instances where when security interests bump up against democracy or human rights records, it tends to be the security or strategic interests that win out. I think in going forward, and you know, there's signs of this, there has to be an understanding that every US strategic interest in Africa, whether it's security, whether it's conflict resolution, whether it's commercial engagement, is underpinned by governance and democracy interests ultimately, so that US interests converge with good governance and accountable governance underpinning them all. So, you know, part of it is kind of a recalibration after these past 4 years where US interest narrowed fairly dramatically to kind of more transactional, short-term understanding of US interest, to kind of re-expand the aperture, kind of look at US interests in Africa as connected in certain ways, not competing, so that security partnerships with authoritarian rulers ultimately harm our interests. Ethiopia has always been a strong US security partner. We're seeing kind of the costs of that now. In this new era as well, I'd say a first step for the US has to be to begin to restore the inspirational power of the US democracy and show US democracy as a system that kind of can renew itself, repair itself, deliver greater prosperity, and rectify historic inequalities. So really beginning with fixing our own house in a way. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield just this past weekend said that, look, if we're going to be a voice around the globe on human rights, we can't whitewash our own issues in our own country. And I think it's very true. And the fact that that statement is even controversial shows that there's a way to go on kind of fixing the US kind of thinking around democracy. So fixing our own house first. I think a second is to embed our Africa engagement on democracy in a much broader global strategy on revitalizing democracy that pushes back on rising authoritarian powers, engages and elevates the voices of reformers and civil society across the globe, and tries more to connect those voices with one another. So really beginning a movement of solidarity among democracy-minded reformers, civil society leaders, and so forth. And in Africa, I think in particular, I think it means expanding our partnerships with elements of civil society and expanding engagement with elements that we haven't traditionally connected with as well. You know, the reform-minded parliamentarians, labor union movements, for example. The media obviously is a big one, and kind of thinking through new ways that media can report, but also kind of supporting the business side of media outlets and so forth, and trying to expand the interface between US civil society, African civil society, and global civil society. Again, trying to create a kind of a global momentum that pushes back on encroaching authoritarian power collectively rather than kind of the US unilaterally. I'll stop there. I know there's plenty of kind of, that's the big picture, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so something you said just struck me, right? One of the approaches is expanding, that the US needs to consider expanding relationships to actors that it has not traditionally engaged, right? Like the media, as you put it, reform-minded parliamentarians. Really interesting stuff. And so Ken, do you mind, shall we move over to your side of the aisle?
Yes, yeah. First off, thank you for having me, and looking forward to the discussion today. And thank you, Jennifer, for highlighting parliamentarians. Legislatures are often neglected in these conversations, and you know, as a student of parliaments, I'm always happy to hear people champion parliaments. Yeah, so I think my thinking pretty much aligns with Jennifer's take of you know, the U.S. throughout the Cold War, the immediate post-independence era in Africa, pursued its interests mostly with an eye on the Soviet Union and what it was doing on the continent. In the early 1990s, right, there was this big push towards support for democracy, but you know, the bad habits never died out, right? So you know, if you look at commercial relations between U.S. oil companies and African governments, right, we complain a lot about the Obiang clan in Equatorial Guinea, but you know, we never mention their commercial counterparts in exploiting Equatorian oil, right? American firms are involved. They're very much part of the bargain that's causing harm in Equatorial Guinea. So I think the challenge for the Biden administration, especially given I think one of the impacts that a lot of people still do not appreciate enough of the Trump era is that it made very clear this disjunction between rhetoric and actual US actions in different parts of the world or in different policy domains. Right. So the cat is now out of the bag. You know, people knew this, but you know, there was still enough momentum for people to pretend that the US was mostly benevolent, right? So people now know that the rhetoric often doesn't match the action. And so part of the repairing of the Trump era mistakes, if you will involve more than just going back to the situation status quo ex ante, to think about new ways of engaging African countries and African peoples through a lens of mutual respect, and knowing that people will no longer buy the story that, oh, we're good democracy promoters all the time, right? People know that the U.S. is pursuing its interests on the continent, and should, right? All countries have a right to do that, but it shouldn't expect that its actions will always be seen as benevolent. In thinking about continued support for democratic governance on the continent, I think American policymakers ought to think about 4 key things that I think will be critical for continued democratic consolidation on the continent. One is a question of, demonstrating that or helping African countries and democrats show that democracy can work, right? So I think we've gone through 30 years of electioneering and democracy promotion and electoral competition, and I think we often underestimate the need to see this system delivering. We see that even in established democracies, when the system is not delivering on people's needs, people rationally start looking for alternatives. Right? So we shouldn't expect that if elections do not produce any outcome because governments are inept and cannot deliver, people will continue supporting electoral democracy. People will look for alternatives. Non-democrats will emerge who will promise, heaven, and will be viable alternatives. So the biggest challenge is to make democracy work. And making democracy work may involve expanding the aperture, as Jennifer put it, to think beyond the cyclical electioneering, to imagine how can security arrangements be in support of democracy, right? Instead of direct security assistance to militaries, why not channel it through the budget process? Involve parliamentarians, right? Make those arrangements public. Force commercial contracts for oil and gas and other natural resources to be public. Instead of engaging in the narrow sort of oppositionist politics of supporting, opposition parties, right? Think about, think tanks to generate homegrown ideas and policy options, right? To make this process of democratic consolidation be driven by domestic sort of forces as opposed to external actors. And then finally, the 4th point is to, think about development assistance or humanitarian assistance in smarter ways that, again, are sustainable for the long haul, as opposed to the good old-fashioned project-based sort of forms of assistance. And then lastly, there's obviously, when we think about democracy promotion in Africa and US engagement, it's hard to ignore China and other non-democratic players on the continent. And I think the challenge for the US moving forward will be how to play this competition in a smart way, right? So that it counters China without making it seem like it sees Africa merely as a means to an end. And I think Ambassador Osinbajo put this very well in his remarks today, right? Africans have many, many needs, all of which cannot be met by just the US. It will need actors. Different African countries will need different partners from all over the world. And so the US can still pursue its interests in the region without coming off as someone, as an actor that's anti-development, or that merely sees Africa and Africans as a means to an end in its competition against China. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to follow up with that?
It's tricky because I agree completely with what my 2 excellent colleagues on the panel have said, but maybe I'll try and say a couple of things they didn't say and also push it further. Perhaps because of where they're situated, they're being rather kind in some ways. They're presenting the challenge perhaps in a rather positive way. Maybe I can put it slightly more pointedly. I think, on the one hand, we do need US engagement in strengthening democracy around the world. It's very hard to imagine a democracy strengthening program that does not include the US being successful. But on the other hand, I think it's also fairly clear that a democracy strengthening program led and dominated by the US would be ill-advised, suboptimal, and prone to failure. So we need US involvement, but we also need the US to be willing to play a more supportive role rather than a leading role. Why do I say that? Well, Ken and Jennifer already provided a number of reasons for this, but I think we also have to come back to the fact that, if we look at the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, the United States is a flawed democracy, not a full democracy. It's got a score right now of 7.92, putting it outside of the category of countries from 8 to 10 who are considered to be good quality democracies. It is a long way behind countries such as Norway, Finland, Iceland, and others in most democracy ratings indices around the world. So the US, on the one hand, as Jennifer says, needs to get its own house in order. Also needs to recognize that there are other examples of much better quality democracy in the world that perhaps represent better models. And then, as Ken rightly pointed out, needs to understand that these conversations with African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, need to take place much more in the context of partnership rather than lecturing. But I think the other thing that we really need to remember is this is not just about the Trump presidency. The Trump presidency brought to the fore many issues and was idiosyncratic in lots of ways. But I think if you talk to a lot of African activists, civil society groups and so on, they were disappointed with some of what happened under the Obama presidency, for example. So I don't think the sorts of questions and the paradoxes that we're highlighting here are simply a product of the last few years of US-Africa policy. I think they have a longer history. And I think it's only by understanding that longer history, as Ken has already pointed out, and the way in which people are increasingly starting to critique it, that we can, or the US can, respond in a much more effective way. I don't think that's just the US, by the way. I think that's true of almost all of the countries that we would put in the category of kind of Western democracy promoters. I would say exactly the same thing about the UK and many other European states, France, Germany, and so on. They're all being challenged, and quite rightly so, by increasing numbers of African academics, intellectuals, and activists who point out past hypocrisy, question when people state that countries are simply out there to promote democracy. And I think in the future, you need a genuine partnership across the world, both of democracy promoters and of African states, that recognizes some of those limitations. And I think that isn't just about having a common conversation about an alliance to support democracy around the world. It's also about allowing some of those voices to speak to the US. If we're going to have a conference led by President Biden on how to rebuild democracy outside the world, that the US is going to lead in terms of talking to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, sub-Saharan African countries that have done a great job on things like police brutality or dealing with race relations should be invited to the American conference dealing with the resurgence of democracy in the United States itself. That's genuine partnership, not just talking to people when you're dealing with their issues, but recognizing that they have expertise and the right to have a voice on some of yours as well. I think that approach, kind of humility, 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 is really important to resetting that relationship and demonstrating to people around the world that the US is really serious about moving on in a fundamentally different way. In terms of what that means on the ground, I think I'd say a couple of quick things about maybe the democracy side of this, which is where I tend to work. The first is that we have seen backsliding in Africa, but we also need to be careful. Freedom House told us last year that Africa had the most number of countries moving away from democracy and the most number moving towards democracy. Malawi was one of the only countries in the world that moved towards democracy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So whilst it's true that the problem of rising authoritarianism is present in Africa, as it is in most parts of the world, it's also important not to get trapped into the idea that every country in Africa is backsliding, that Africa has moved significantly away from democratic progress. In fact, we have a lot of countries that have been stuck in a kind of electoral authoritarian middle ground for a very long period of time and haven't really moved one way or another. Uganda's, Zimbabwe's, Tanzania's, etc. We actually have a relatively small number of countries, I think, that have moved a dramatic amount in the last few years. Countries like Gambia, which have moved to be much more democratic as a result of getting rid of long-standing dictators, and perhaps more recently Benin and Senegal that have moved the other way. But I think it's really important to break down those different trajectories, to understand that they're driven by very different forces, and to understand that some of the patterns and understandings of democratic erosion we see in other parts of the world are not present in Africa, or at least do not play out in that way. And therefore we can't simply export analysis of, you know, the rise of anti-democratic forces in other parts of the world and expect it to be able to play in the African context. For me, the really exciting opportunity would be to engage in countries like Senegal and Benin that do have democratic traditions, that have moved away from that in recent years, where perhaps there is a really strong base that could be used for a process of democratic revival. But, and I think this is the critical point that both of the former speakers have also touched on, we know that democratization is driven by domestic forces. We know that to be sustainable and successful, it has to be driven domestically. We know that actually international actors have been relatively poorly placed to promote democracy, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, the DRC, Somalia. You know, the international community can't wave a magic wand and generate democracy. It is generated by those domestic forces. And so I think one of the things we also need to focus more on is what is the long-term strategy of not trying to deliver democracy for people, but creating the space for people to win democracy for themselves. What is the process through which the US and other countries can strengthen academics, civil society groups, free speech, the media, to allow people to win their own battles and to win their own democracies? That's what's required to allow countries to establish their own democratic founding myths, to, you know, win their own battles against their own authoritarian regimes, rather than it being seen to be internationally supplied. And the final line, in doing that, one of the things we have to be really careful is to, of course, do no harm. And one of the really, I think, worrying findings of recent academic research is that one of the triggers of backsliding or backlashes against civil society groups and NGOs in authoritarian states is significant spikes in foreign funding for those NGOs in the 2 to 3 years before. So one of the things we have to be aware about is that the way in which we engage around the world can strengthen partners, but it can also weaken them and leave them vulnerable to attack. If we want to support civil society groups, we need to find ways of doing that that doesn't simply generate and trigger backlash, anti-NGO laws, you know, measures designed to cripple them in the next year. So longer term, thinking about multiple electoral cycles, thinking about supporting partners to generate the conditions for domestic transformation, but doing so in a way that really focuses on the things that we have done in the past that have actually created challenges. And in that sense, again, coming back to the idea of partnership, asking those civil society groups and those academics and those pro-democratic forces, what's the way that we can support them that keeps them safest, and allowing that to set the next agenda.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I mean, there's a lot to work through in those responses. And if I may just follow up on your last comment, Nick, about partnerships, right? So clearly, one thing we know is happening on the continent is the emergence of multiple significant partnerships, right? Economic partnerships across Africa, African countries. We also know that these partnerships bring with them certain pressures, right? They exert pressures on Africa's capacity to build or, you know, consolidate democracy, you know, or continue with democratic reforms one way or the other. We have, you know, theocratic pressures from, you know, the Arabic or Persian countries, mostly from Saudi Arabia, with its Wahhabist and Salafist influences, you know, which of course is part of the issues we have unfolding in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and the rest of the countries. We have a second trend, which unfolds with, you know, Russian military expansionism through the Wagner enterprise across the continent. We have the Chinese, of course, you know, the Chinese hunt for material, raw material resources, and its non-interventionist clause, whatever that is, right? I mean, I cannot think that non-intervention is an oxymoron, right, in the context of that approach in Africa. But, you know, depends on who is asking and who is answering. And then we also have, Turkey's projection and its alignment, with Muslim anxieties across and control, the quest for control for energy and gas resources. And so the question then becomes, if, like you said, Nick, the US definitely cannot drive democracy promotion across the continent. It's going to, they're going to drive it into a ditch. We know part of, why that is. If, there's need for multilateral engagements, right? And, but then there's also the reality of these non-traditional actors with specific interests on the continent. How can this new US-Africa re-engagement, right? As Jennifer has said, how can it open apertures that drives the continent towards greater sustainable development and democratic governance, rather than, allowing these currents to drive it to the other side? Nick.
Thanks. I mean, I think we need to deal with the question of the relationship between those economic and political changes. And as you say, there's a remarkable complexity going on right now in terms of the different forces at work. We are in a multipolar world. China is more significant than it has been before, but also other countries. We don't talk enough about Turkey, India, Russia, Israel, and a bunch of other states, that are becoming increasingly significant in little pockets of foreign policy and little pockets of economic policy, depending on where we look. And that complex picture then means that engagement is much more complicated than it has been in the past. That's, I think, why a number of us emphasize the need for international alliances, whether it's in terms of economic or political policy, in order to be able to achieve progress, because otherwise the significant number of actors means that the ability of any one organization to push forward progress is reduced. As Ken said, I think very well, one of the big challenges here is that, of course, we often see what happens politically being undermined by what's happening economically. So we see multinational companies doing deals that undermine democratic progress that's attempted to be made in other areas. A really classic example is the recent decision of Vodacom in Tanzania to follow government guidance to not allow people to tweet or text the name of the main opposition candidate in the general election. This is a multinational company based in a democracy that commits itself to free speech and claims that it's all about increasing the ability to communicate around the world, that is then doing the bidding of an authoritarian regime to censor the opposition in an election to preserve its market status. So I think that, the complexity of that relationship is very important. And I think one of the things we're starting to see is people being critical of democracy because they think it goes hand in hand with a kind of neoliberal economics that leaves people very vulnerable to globalization and prevents states from looking after their poorest citizens. I think that conflation is actually incorrect. I think if you look at most African states, and Ken and I have talked about this many times, and we could talk about how strong the correlations are, but in general, a lot of our democratic states are performing a bit better than some of our more authoritarian states when it comes to providing public services. So it's not the case that democracy is simply a proviso for neoliberalism that's stripping away the state and allowing increasing levels of inequality and poverty. But there is that perception amongst some critics of democracy and the democracy project. And so I think one of the things we need to be able to demonstrate over the next 20 years, if we want democracy to flourish around the world, is that democracy is good for economic progress, it's good for dealing with inequality, it's good for helping the people at the very bottom end of the spectrum. And we need to not assume that people believe in democracy, but actually go out and make that argument. But we can't go out and make that argument and win that argument if the companies that are based in the US and the UK and elsewhere are not committing themselves to democratic values and are not committing themselves to paying their taxes and are not committing themselves to helping the countries in which they operate. Because otherwise we're basically setting out a set of rhetoric that doesn't actually have roots in reality. And again, that's going to be exploded, just as Ken described, past kind of hypocrisy in international relations being exploded. So one of the things I'd really like to see in terms of the way that the US and the UK move forwards, is that any attempt to talk about democracy and development, it goes hand in hand with expecting their own companies to operate in a much more pro-democratic, pro-developmental way around the world. I think that, again, is a really necessary first condition to basically demonstrate good faith before we then start to engage in other areas.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the economic story on the continent complicates the discussion about governance and democracy more generally in interesting ways. Again, depending on the country that you're looking at, right? So I mean, I tend to think that just like the West has struggled to externalize its systems of government on the continent, China, Turkey, India, Israel will also struggle to externalize their systems on the continent, right? You know, I struggle to see any country in Africa that would be a democracy were it not for China or Turkey or Israel or you know the less sort of democracy promoting entities in the region. So that said, I think I'd like to reiterate Nick's point that democratization will necessarily have to be domestic and driven by attempts to balance domestic forces in different African countries. And there will be a minimal role for foreign actors in that process, right? Because there are countries that have significant exposure to non-African major global players, but which have nonetheless managed to continue on the path to greater democratic consolidation. Ghana, for example, right? And so I think the way to think about this is, and perhaps this is where Nick and I, we're moving in the same direction, but we often jostle over this, right? The question of tying regime type to economic performance. I think the danger there is that when inevitably, right, crises happen or democracy doesn't deliver on the promised development, then people tend to see autocracy as the alternative to economic development. Now, I think that the one way out of that logjam would be to make sure that we're not over-promising what democracy can do, and making it very, very clear that or at times even forgetting using the term democracy, but insisting on systems of accountability. Breaking this down to specific institutions, right? So public finance management, how to do it right, whether you're talking about Rwanda or Malawi or Ghana, right? Legislatures, the judiciary, right? Decentralization as sort of a basis for future democratization and local elections, right? The many different sort of interlocking institutional structures and processes that generate democracy. I think we'll do a better job if we break this thing down into its different components and have different players doing different things in the different sites of democracy promotion. And then going back to this sort of big picture foreign actors in the continent, I think when you think about security in the Sahel or more recently Mozambique, right, those challenges are in part driven by local complacency. The simmering conflict in northern Mozambique could have been ended very early on. Mozambican elites did not act soon enough. Similarly, Boko Haram, right? We all remember back in the late 2010s when Nigeria could have done more, but it did not. In Mali and the insurgency in northern Mali, Burkina, and Niger, similarly, elites in Mali could have done more sooner instead of outsourcing that conflict to the French. And the danger there, as you highlight, is the fact that as these conflicts get more and more globalized, they'll become harder to solve because then it will no longer be about local sort of solutions, but this global war on terror and its ability to fuel itself, both from a recruitment perspective on the part of the insurgents, but also in terms of government's inability to deal with much stronger forces with global connections. So all to say that the way I think about these processes, even in the context of international actors, is localize, because it's only then that you'll develop lasting local institutional forms and practices that are self-sustaining for the long haul. Thinking, even as we think about the global picture, we should never lose perspective of that sort of local foundation of democratization and accountability.
All right, thank you. So I want to follow up on that thought in a minute, but before then, perhaps let's, Jennifer, do you want to add to that? So Ken notes that democratization will be domestic, right? There will be minimal role for international actors, but we cannot also ignore the history of democratization on the continent, right? And the role international legitimacy or legitimization, as well as international capital conditionality has played in the processes so far. Of course, there are gaps. But if we're saying localize, of course we will localize, but then the reality at this point is that there are huge resource gaps. There is huge institutional capacity gaps. And as Ken just pointed out, that there is a complex relationship between economics and democracy on the continent, right? And so again, what prospects exist for this new US-Africa re-engagement with as it regards mediating some of these potentially anti-democratic pressures from the economic partnerships that's ongoing and unfolding across Africa?
Well, look, I mean, I do think that democracy needs to take a greater centrality in US engagement in Africa, but it cannot be the be-all and end-all of US engagement. And if China is providing infrastructures and business opportunities and trade missions and so forth that Africans want, but with a theory of non-interference behind it, the US can't go in just with a democracy message. I mean, that has to be part of what it does, but the US cannot win in this, if it doesn't play. So democracy, again, has to be embedded in a much broader engagement in Africa that has to have much more on the commercial side that creates economic opportunities and training opportunities, for example. On the security side, although as Ken says, there are different ways of doing that, of engaging with municipal governments. Can we have partnerships between municipal governments where a lot of the economic opportunity is going to lie in Africa? Deliberative democracy at the community level. I would also like to see a lot more non-governmental engagement in Africa, with the US government playing a facilitating role between civil society in the United States, unions, media, municipal government, for example, universities, the science establishment, science diplomacy, those kinds of non-governmental things that kind of expose a broader swath of Americans to a broader swath of African players that are really going to kind of drive the future. It's not always our government that is inspirational in the United States. It's most often kind of activists, civil society, science, university, the educational establishment. And so, we can talk about, democracy, but if we slam our borders shut to, students or to certain people from certain countries, we undercut that. So part of it is kind of expanding the interface between the elements that kind of, underpin US exceptionalism, if you will. I don't like to use that term. And the comparative advantages that the US may have over some of the other players within in Africa. So it's not, we can't hang our entire policy around democracy, although we can center democracy within that broader strategy.
Thank you. And so I think at this point, let's bring in some audience questions. JT Tomazeski asks, understanding the supportive statements of democracy in Africa, what do you make of the US State Department's recent statements on elections in Benin, Chad, and Djibouti? Yeah, Ken, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, I think the State Department's response reflects the sort of schizophrenia that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning. Right, these are strong allies of the U.S. for various reasons, and the State Department will continue to support the government that wins out the day in an attempt to maintain allies on side. And on the one hand, right, I think that if we accept that states will pursue their interests, right, it should give us also pause in being gung-ho about America's capacity to promote democracy, right? Because if the premise is that America will always pursue its interests in the region, by definition, it means that oftentimes it will, put democracy on the wayside and pursue other interests along the way, which is to say that this is not surprising, and I think it's consistent with what has happened in the past, and we probably should expect this to be happening under both Democratic and Republican administrations, which reinforces the need for domestic origins of democratic consolidation as a way of creating the conditions for a virtuous cycle, so that U.S. presidents find themselves congratulating democratic elected presidents, as opposed to being forced into this situation of congratulating Talon with a dictatorial 80% plus victory. And then I'll finish by emphasizing two points, right? In the same vein, we should remember that all countries have domestic politics. All else equal, people do not like foreign interference in their domestic politics, right? Americans over the last 5 years or so have been expressing this. This is true everywhere, right? So I think to bring in Nick's earlier point about humility, I think even democracy promoting states like the US or European countries should have that in mind, that people generally do not like being lectured on how to run their own affairs. So democracy promotion has to be done with respect and not finger wagging, and it should be done in a way that thinks about the long term. I'm still optimistic that Benin can bounce back from the last few years of the Talon administration. I think the ingredients for democratization exist in Benin, so that when countries experience speed bumps like Benin has in the recent past, we shouldn't throw it in the basket of the authoritarian sort of category, because as we saw in the U.S. over the last 4 years, right, these things are cyclical. Sometimes you elect would-be autocrats, and you hope that there are domestic institutions that check them and make sure that they don't stay in power forever.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to add to that? You are muted.
I keep switching. I agree with that, and I think again, I mean, the finger wagging is not always the most effective. My hope is that with those rather mealy-mouthed, tepid statements, there's also some kind of engagement happening in perhaps a quiet way, and perhaps greater engagement with some of the civil society leaders and drivers, opposition leaders as well, happening at the same time. But I think we know that the kind of browbeating of leadership does not necessarily move the needle in terms of democracy.
All right, so Sneha Mahapatra has another question. My question is, if in countries plagued by issues of a lack of sense in citizenship and suffering from poverty, is it realistic to expect a well-functioning democratic government? And taking into consideration what we have learned from observing the rise in authoritarian regimes with backsliding in Eastern European countries, Brazil, Middle East, and even lately India, is having an open state with focus on growth, respect of minority rights, freedom of press, and promotion of human rights a prerequisite to well-functioning democratic states and prosperity? I guess, Nick, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I guess what we as, as a political scientist, what we would say is that we have a set of factors that we think make it easier to do democracy, right? Having an established national infrastructure, a coherent national identity, solid amount of national wealth, low levels of unemployment, et cetera, have often been posited by, my colleagues and myself as things that make it easier to build a democracy. But one of the things that I argued in my book, Democracy in Africa in 2015, and I think remains true, is that Africa sees a number of countries that buck that trend, that are kind of democratized against the odds. Now, we can debate how consolidated and stable those democracies are and how ingrained they are. But look at a country like Ghana. If we go back to the 1990s, Ghana didn't necessarily look like a great bet. It was a country that had a series of military coups. It was a country that didn't have a thriving economy. It was a country that had a long period of kind of military rule or quasi-military rule. Similarly, we could go back with a number of other countries. If you were to talk about a Benin, now, of course, we're talking, as Ken says, right now about Benin is moving away from democracy. But, if we went back to the 1990s, Benin managed to establish one of the most open and competitive political systems in Africa, despite having none of the economic preconditions we would, point to, not having high levels of wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's true that many of these factors are challenges. They're challenges that countries face all around the world. What I don't think is true is that if you don't have those factors, you can't become a democracy. I think we've actually seen countries surmount those challenges and establish democracies. And so I think it's worth not sort of becoming defeatist about these conditions as meaning that you can't build democracy and therefore you shouldn't look to support new democracies. I think what we should recognize is that actually a number of African countries are democratizing or have built very young democracies, potentially very fragile ones, and require greater support. It's remarkable to me in some ways that we still have so many democracies on the continent, given what the continent's faced. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the next few years are going to be worse. We're going to see high levels of economic recession around different parts of the world due to COVID-19. The absence of vaccines in African countries will make that problem more significant and prolonged than in some Western countries. We're also going to see increasing problems over debt. We've already seen Zambia go into debt default. It will not be the only country to do that in the next couple of years. And this will place a real pressure. The pressure will be on all governments, authoritarian and democratic. If the West really wants to give democratic governments a chance in the countries where they're already established, providing strong levels of financial support and economic aid to those countries would be one way of offsetting those challenges to democracy that we see. But again, here, as in the other areas, we see the risk of hypocrisy and double standards, because of course, what a lot of Africans who are watching will say is, where are the vaccines, right? If you really want to support democracy and development around the world, share the vaccines, don't hoard the vaccines. And if you're not willing to do it on something like that, that's a life and death issue, why should we believe you on everything else? But I do think that the key message that we should take is that actually you can sometimes build democracy in really unpromising contexts, but it takes a lot of bravery. And one of the things that we might want to do is think about trying to support those systems in these particularly difficult times.
Thank you. And so Michelle Lee asks, what opportunities do you see for civil society in Tanzania under President Samia Hassan? Jennifer, do you want to take it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, it's early to say. Obviously, there are some promising signals in terms of re-engagement with the international community, on movements on COVID and kind of taking the science seriously. But the ruling party, CCM, has been there a very long time and has not brooked challenges to its kind of rule easily over time. And so I could maybe see a softening in terms of civil society. One hopes in terms of the NGO laws and the information laws and the data sharing laws and so forth. But I mean, the test comes when the power of the ruling party is fundamentally challenged. And the president is one person in a system that has been many decades in the making. So it will take, I think it's a moment of opportunity, and my hope is that the US and others can kind of encourage and incentivize greater liberalization. But there are many forces ranged against the president in kind of a struggle for the soul, let's say, of the CCM and of Tanzania. So it's an opportunity, but not a guarantee. But it is a moment that the US should be engaged and others to try to make the most of the opening, however narrow it might be.
And so that's a really interesting statement. The president is one person in a system, in an entrenched system, right? And I was just wondering, would that have been a description we would have used for the previous president, right? Because, so I'm wondering, are there some gender effects at play here, right? Because we're already beginning to, talk about the president, what is she going to do? And for most times I keep hearing, she is up against a lot of forces and all that. So is there a gender effect here? Are we expecting that she will, to some extent, be a pawn on this chess game, the ruling party chess game? Because I'm just wondering, will that have been something we would have said of Magufuli?
Well, I don't know about the gender component of it. One thing is that she became president kind of through being vice president. I wish her every success, but she does not have a strong base and constituency of her own within Tanzania. She's not been a particular power broker within the CCM. That may change, but it may have more to do with kind of competing factions within the CCM. Whether she's able to manage it, navigate it, rise above, consolidate, is kind of a question to be answered. I wouldn't call her a pawn. I mean, she has an important role to play in that, but again, it's an entrenched system where a single individual without a particularly strong base may have trouble down the line. But we've been surprised before at people who are seemingly in a relatively weak position in terms of constituency or base, accidentally ascend to the president in some way and ultimately prove to be much more powerful than many people anticipated.
Thank you, absolutely. Ken, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah. I think Jennifer is spot on that. President Hassan has unique features that make a little bit of an outsider within the CCM system. She's from Zanzibar, hasn't had her own power base within the party, was under the shadow of Magufuli for a long time. But I think CCM is also interesting because it's one of Africa's celebrated organizations, strong parties, right, with a very strong grassroots reach, which make it pretty useful for anyone who would want to capture the party and use it as sort of the tool of governance, right? So, Nick and others have highlighted that even with Magufuli, right, Magufuli was able to do everything that he did during his time in office, in part because he had the organizational resource of CCM as a party to work with. So I think President Hassan, if she can navigate the intra-CCM politics, she may be able to get the second term because, again, CCM is very dominant. Whoever wins the CCM nomination most certainly will win the presidency in 2025. And on intra-CCM politics and how the US could engage, I think again, Jennifer's right here that CCM has been many things throughout its history, right? Sometimes it's been a coercive authoritarian party. Other times it's been a hegemonic party that wants to be populist and to genuinely win popular elections through service, right? It's done a lot in terms of primary education access, healthcare, secondary education, etc., infrastructure under Magufuli. So, it's quite possible to engage the progressive elements within CCM, and they do exist, right? For those of us who are closely following the vice presidential horse race, right, it was very clear, what the progressive wing was and who are the old guards who are trying to push back. I think that contest is at a stalemate right now. Mpango is a very safe choice on the part of President Hassan, but that tussle will continue to play out within the party. And it's very likely that the progressive wing could win, so that we have a very different sort of CCM that's more popular facing in its posture, as opposed to the coercive, authoritarian, hegemonic party that Magufuli tried to make it during his tenure.
Thank you. Jonathan K., I hope I pronounced that well, asks, what role can the US government play to aid African youth with economic opportunities who want increased democratic governance but find limited employment opportunities? Nick, do you want to start off?
I mean, that's a difficult one, right? It's not, the challenge of youth employment is a big issue in many parts of the world. And we've just talked about some of the great difficulties we're likely to face. One of the things that does soak up a lot of employment in many countries is tourism, and tourism is down right now because of COVID-19. So, we're seeing a lot of problems. I saw a report from the International Labour Organization, which came out quite recently, that suggested that youth employment and female employment are two of the things that have really suffered. And that partly reflects the fact that these are two categories that often work in the informal economy rather than the formal economy, and are relatively easy to lay off with relatively low costs to employers. So I think it's a good question, and it's a question that's been a significant challenge in the past, but will be intensified by the current trends that we're seeing right now. In terms of what the US government can do, I mean, one of the things I think we've been hinting at is that there's a limited amount the US government can do. And one thing that we perhaps haven't put on the table enough is that as economic growth in all of the countries that we're talking about goes, and most of the countries we're talking about are growing at 5-6% every year, some of them much a bit lower, some of them a bit more. As that happens, the ability of the international community to significantly change the conditions in a country for a large number of people becomes significantly limited. And so, for example, if you look at, the ODA budget for Africa, it might look like it's going up or staying constant. If you then look at that relative to the budget expenditure of African countries, it's falling considerably as a percentage. And that means that the levers that international actors have are actually becoming weaker rather than stronger. So in terms of what international governments can do, though, I think one of the key answers is what we were talking about earlier, which is to ensure that their companies engage in countries in fair ways that create employment in those countries, rather than with very limited numbers of jobs in those countries and most of the jobs being held in headquarters elsewhere, and with profits repatriated to those headquarters, so that there isn't significant investment and long-term development in African economies. I think that's one thing that can be done. Perhaps one of the other things that we could point to, though, is that one of the things that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been criticized for historically is encouraging African governments to do things that have cut employment. In other words, structural adjustment policies, and even in their more recent guise, the advice that will be given to governments like Zambia that are in debt crises will be to cut government expenditure to balance the books before international support can be forthcoming. One of the inevitable consequences of that advice is a fall in employment. And so I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that sometimes the advice that we give can undermine the goals that we set for ourselves in other areas. And I think that will be something to watch for in the next couple of years, when I don't know what Ken thinks, but I can see the IMF and the World Bank becoming increasingly involved in African countries, not necessarily because they're welcome, but because of crises over debt and the need for IMF and World Bank deals before creditors are willing to restructure debt agreements.
Thank you. I think we can get in one more question before we have to wrap up. So clearly, the changing landscape of global capital and its, perhaps let's move to another one because we've kind of touched on that. Democratic governance is no doubt the global norm, has become the global norm, even as it exists side by side perceived contrarian currents and ideologies. And when we throw into this mist, the increasing call to acknowledge and elevate African local knowledge production and practices, especially with, the new institutionalism approach, right? And its insistence on a key role for informal institutions in statecraft. This becomes, a bit complex and, rather complicated. Are there tensions in these paradigms, right? Of course, critical scholars would come back quick and say that, there are within African traditions and values, that there are democratic ideas and notions, right, that exist within, African traditions and values. Well, are there tensions in these two paradigms? What implications might this have for substantive democratic reform and governance on the continent, right? So Ken, you did, talk about localizing knowledge, local knowledge production. How do we balance this with, the globalizing norm of democracy and the fact, of course, that is created around the idea of the modern state, and its bureaucratization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so before I answer it, just to echo something that Nick said, I think the US has a tremendous opportunity over the next 50 or so years to help African farms grow as engines of employment in the region. And if China is winning the infrastructure game, in part because we know that U.S. farms are terrible. Those of us who live in D.C. know how long it takes to repair a small patch of road here. But the U.S. has great finance, has U.S. businesses have a track record that they can run on, and there's absolutely no reason why the U.S. can't leverage that strength to help African farms grow. So that development is not just about targeting lower income people, but also helping businesses grow as a foundation for mass employment. And really hoping to see the Biden administration start thinking in this direction. Now, on your question about the supposed tension between African practices or traditions and democratic consolidation, my view on this is that I never really understand what people say when they mean by tradition, because often when I push people, they tend to stick African traditions to 1600, right? As if Africans don't change with the times, or it's often someone who's in a position of authority in West Africa, chiefly authority, where places where chiefs are strong, who want to claim that as a source of legitimacy. I think that the process of localization will be different in different places. Africa has changed quite a bit. It will be difficult to try and impose, an 18th century model of government on a continent that's 50% urban and likely to become even more urban, right? So the question there shouldn't be, is there tension between African traditions and democracy or accountable government? I think there are none. In part because when we think about accountable government, it's about people being empowered to demand public goods and services and accountability from their leaders, and that can happen whether you're talking about some village in northern Cameroon or urban dwellers in Yaoundé or in Dar es Salaam. Right? There shouldn't be any tension there. Because these societies have been evolving over time with their different political processes. That said, I think the one of the lingering tensions will be perhaps regional or identity-based differences in approaches to governance. especially since elites can use these supposed differences as a way of mobilizing popular support in democratic states. But even that, can change over time. If you believe, some of the findings that we see in the Afrobarometer surveys, right? More and more Africans identify with their nations as opposed to their ethnic groups. And that's a sign of the times, right? We shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that this is an unchanging region. It is changing. Younger Africans don't speak, their parents' languages, especially those in urban areas. And so the tradition, the 16th century, the way I put it, sort of tradition, no longer has as much sway as we may think it does.
Thank you. I'd like to extend this panel by another hour or two, but unfortunately I don't get to make that decision. So I think we have to round off at this point. And so perhaps we'll start with you, we start with you, Jennifer. Do you want to provide concluding remarks? What do you think, generally speaking, one should expect of the US-Africa re-engagement going forward?
Well, look, at this point, it's early days. I do see promising signs. Again, kind of even at the tone matters. Rhetoric can be just symbolic, but it also matters if you're sending the right signals. I think some of the re-engagement in multilateral organizations, a bit of humility that we see from people like the US ambassador to the UN saying, look, we've got our problems, we need to work on these issues collectively. So I see a little bit more of a kind of an idea of solidarity and partnership, working on some of the very complex and vexing challenges, whether it be democracy in an age of disinformation and polarization and populism is one, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on global structural inequalities that COVID has kind of made plain. I see just a greater kind of engagement and willingness to work collectively on those problems, which to my mind is promising, but we are about 3 months in. And so my hope is that the momentum continues.
Thank you. Ken, we're 3 months in. Is there a possibility that there will be, the tide might change? Or
yeah, so I mean, there's a big risk of business as usual, right? And some of the appointments in the sort of Africa office within the government, excuse me, seem to suggest that the Biden administration may be pursuing business as usual, which would be unfortunate. That said, I think two things will continue to perhaps force the US to change strategy for the better. One is that, expectations on the Africa side have been raised, right? People will no longer accept business as usual. The US will be put to task, right, to match rhetoric with action, and will face a lot of criticism from African academics, African publics, and certainly public officials. Even listening to the ambassadors this morning and the deputy president from Nigeria. Africans want more and better engagement from the US. The second thing will be, of course, competition from China, right? China has elevated the game, meaning that the US will either have to step up or cede the ground. And hopefully, for everyone's sake, right, I hope that this spurs the US to step up its game with a view of building stronger, mutually respectful relationships with African states.
Thank you. Nick?
Thanks. I think maybe just to end, I'll highlight a slightly different point that I think underpins a lot of what we said, which is that, one of the things you really need if you want to make long-term substantial change, or if you want to empower people to do it, is to do the same thing for a while. And doing one thing for the next 3 or 4 years and another thing for the 3 or 4 years after that and another thing for the 3 or 4 years after that means that you don't have a sustained effect. because the sorts of changes you're trying to bring about are long-term, they're systematic, they're structural, and they can't be delivered in a short period of time, especially because, as we've all highlighted, international actors actually have limited capacity to affect real change on the ground. I think, when I work occasionally and talk to sort of the Swedish and the Danes on the ground, they sometimes do seem to have a model of actually working on a set of issues beyond one government. Even with a transfer of power, they sometimes try and hold on to certain policy priorities. I know historically, talking to people within DFID, which is of course now part of FCDO in the UK, there's been an attempt to move a bit in that direction, not just looking at one elections, but how can we support institutions across 2 or 3 elections, an electoral cycle approach. I think if we want to make a big investment, the US is serious about re-engaging on these issues, then one of the things that needs to change is not just some of the important modalities that we've talked about, but actually establishing a long-term commitment on which they can build consensus that can stay beyond one presidency and actually invest over a number of years and decades in order to actually achieve something, rather than the chopping and changing, which has tended to characterize US policy recently. I think that kind of long-term commitment would be a really good thing, both because it adds and allows for policy learning, but also, as I say, because I think we have to get real. That's what's actually required to make a significant difference in countries around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Nick. This has been a really interesting and substantive discussion. And thank you also our guests for being with us today. And we are going on a break from now till 12:45, and we'll be right back here for our final panel, which is on Africa's post-pandemic economic recovery with Peter Lewis. And so once again, it's been a pleasure having you with us, and thank you for participating. And we'll see you on the other side. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure seeing you all.
Good to see you.